what I want to do just for a few minutes before I get into, so I'm going to talk a little bit about research content. I'm going to talk about my research agenda a little bit. I did want to just touch on a couple of things that other people have said. This is a really neat forum. I didn't go to anything like this when I was a PhD student. I wish I had. I've heard a lot of things today that I've sort of never really conceptualized and thought about. As soon as I heard them, I'm like, that's exactly how it works. That's worked for me. Let me just add a couple of things. I want to reiterate a couple of thoughts that I've heard. The first one is, it is extremely important that you start writing down your ideas early. And when I say writing, I don't mean kind of talking to your buddies and writing stuff on the board. I mean, sit in front of a computer or a journal or whatever it is, write the ideas down. It is so important to be concrete about how you're thinking about things. It can be all clear in your head until you try to write down a simple model. And you realize, oh, that's not quite as simple as I thought. Theory in particular makes you be precise. I'm not a theorist, I'm a failed theorist. And when other markets theorists didn't end up doing it. But writing forces you to be precise about your ideas. It's extremely important to do that and to do it early. On all the papers that I've written, especially the ones with Joey, we write the front end half a dozen times. That's just the way it works. Ideas are extremely fluid. It's not like this concrete thing where you're building a boat. Every day you build 4% more of the boat than it's eventually built. It's not like that. Ideas are fluid. They're kind of like clouds, and the process of performing a song over and over and over and over again, the song changes, and eventually you play it in a different key, or maybe you expand a stanza or whatever it is. They're fluid, and so you have to work with them a little bit. The last thing I'll mention, I don't know if this is a positive or negative thing, I do know that it's true. Ideas are increasingly important to present in sexy, flashy, easy ways to understand. Attention spans are super short these days. It used to be where people would read your paper, and then it was where people would read your introduction, and then it was where maybe you could get someone who'd read your abstract, and now titles are a big deal. I'm convinced that titles have a causal impact on paper impact. We should probably think about writing that paper at some point, because I'm almost positive it's true. I don't think everybody would agree with me on that, but I think it's important to think about how your audience will receive your ideas originally, because presentation and the way that people receive things and regard them initially is important. I want to spend about 15 minutes or so talking about an agenda that I've been a part of a little bit. This is a book that was written by a New York Times columnist about almost over 20 years ago now, Thomas Friedman, called The World is Flat. And the idea basically is this was the coming of age of the information era. And the idea was the internet and email and all these technological innovations were going to make physical location not super important. Because if I can email you, or if I can talk to you, or I can Skype with you, sort of where you are is sort of irrelevant. So it's this concept of the earth flattening. So physical location wouldn't be super important. That's a little bit unfair to the book, but that's kind of the overall thesis. Let's get Richard Florida, who's an urban economist at the University of Toronto, had a tongue-in-cheek response to this a few years later. There's an article published in Atlantic Monthly. The world is spiky, so the world is not flat. The world is spiky, and he gives these examples. This is population. Obviously, the world is not uniformly distributed, where every person is 1.7 miles from everybody else. It's not that way. There's lots of things that are spiky or clustered. Just another few things. Here's poverty in the United States. Poverty is heavily concentrated in some areas. Natural resources, as you might expect, again, not uniformly distributed. This is not surprising at all. This is oil and gas reserves and coal. This is a cool map if you've never seen it. This is what the United States looks like from space at night. And you can see that luminosity is anything but uniformly distributed. There's a couple of neat things here that at least living in the West, just how dark the West is, and all the economic activity is on the right-hand side with Seattle, Los Angeles, the Bay Area being exceptions. There's a cool application of this particular study that's in Nature Science. I can't remember what the journal is. The title of the paper was "Africa's Not as Poor as You Think It Is." And the idea was you can use, so you're trying to figure out how poor or rich a country is, and you don't trust the data. You don't trust the data from whatever source. think about the following. You can use a training data set where you do have reliable data, run a regression of GDP or economic output on luminosity, get a slope, and then expand the sample to areas where you don't trust the data, but you observe the luminosity perfectly. Then you can sort of infer what the economic activity probably is. The title of the paper is Africa's Not as Poor as You Think, which guess what the conclusion of that paper is. So, some co-authors and I got interested in this idea of the importance of sort of where you are. That's not something that's come up yet in the talk today. I can just tell you this. Your colleagues are really important. Where you end up will dramatically influence your research productivity. The single biggest influence probably on the path that my research took is having to serendipitously end up 2 offices down from Joe Engelberg at UNC. We just happened to end up there at the same year, and a lot of stuff changed. Your colleagues make a lot of difference. One of the reasons why I think that headquarters cities are so important is because they are your spatial colleagues in some sense. They don't necessarily work with you, but you're sharing the same space. You're on the same subways. Your kids are in the same schools. You sort of become influenced by those you're around. Here's an interesting quote from Jeff Immelt. So a couple of years ago, General Electric moved from Fairfield, Connecticut to Boston, to the Seaport area of Boston. So look at this quote. It's kind of interesting. I want people that are down in the Seaport, I want them to walk out of our office every day and be terrified, he told the crowd. I want to be in a sea of ideas, so paranoia reigns supreme. To look out the window and see deer running across, I don't care about it. So General Electric moved to a vastly more expensive place. It's extremely complicated to move a company's headquarters. What's the reason he wanted to do that? Because he wanted his employees bathing in the sea of ideas that just got their brains working, got their brains thinking. Again, back to this idea that Joey talked about earlier, a reading group, presenting your stuff in front of people, writing stuff. You want your brain constantly churning on ideas. I wrote a paper, I guess a couple of years ago. We're still revising it. It's called Urban Vibrancy and Firm Value Creation. Here's the basic idea. If you haven't sort of worked with this data at all, the idea basically is that if you think of the map of the United States, where's most of the value being created, and what cities are stock prices going up the most after accounting for industry destinations. It's not exactly what we do. For the purposes of this talk, that's how I'm going to describe it. I'll give you just a couple of observations to whet your appetite. 2/3 of the market cap for new companies that have gone public since 1980 are in Seattle and Bay Area. Think about that. 2/3 of the market cap for new companies that have gone public since 1980 are in Seattle and Bay Area. There's a ton of tech in there. There's a ton of non-tech in there. There's Starbucks and Costco and Nordstrom's and Ross Stores, PayPal, Gilead Pharmaceuticals, etc. Okay, so this is I'm going to talk about 3 papers for about 5 minutes each. So this is what we do in this paper. So we're going to run just a simple descriptive regression. Why am I talking about this paper? When you're working in an area that's not super developed, it's a little easier to make a contribution because there's value in descriptive work. Because if people don't know just what the basic patterns are, then there isn't a lot of debate on what the mechanisms are. You get some credit for just describing the cross-sectional, the cross-sectional variation. So we're going to run a regression here where we're going to take Tobin's Q. What's Tobin's Q? You can think about Tobin's Q as being like this. You buy a rental house for $200,000. You rent it for a few years. You do some renovations. Think about the total amount of money that you've paid for the house and all the money that you've paid into renovating the house. Maybe say you're into it for $250,000. So sort of you've put $250,000 of your own money, some of it's come in the form of rent, into the house. Does that mean the house is worth $250,000? No, California, the house could be worth $1 million because the houses are appreciated in that area. So then the market value of the house would be like $1 million, but the book value of the house would be like $250,000. So the market to book ratio would be 4. And sometimes we use that ratio to approximate value creation. So we're going to ask the question, how much do Tobin's Qs vary across industry? So industry fixed effects, how much do Tobin's Qs, this 4-to-1 ratio, How does it vary through the business cycle with through the business cycle with year fixed effects? And after we've controlled for industry and year, or industry interact with year, that's something we do in the paper as well, how much does it vary across cities? So the prediction is, if cities are creating more value, some more than others, say San Francisco is creating more value per company than Cleveland, how would that show up in a Tobin's Q regression? Well, if shareholders get some of that value, then you expect to find differences in these city fixed effects. Here's the punchline of the paper. So I want you to think about the sample as going from 1975, the year I was born, through 2015, so 40 years, 4 decades, decade. I'm going to do the analysis for the first 20 years, and then I'm going to do the analysis for the second 20 years. So each city is going to have its own little estimate of how much value creation there is after accounting for industry fixed effects and year fixed effects. And so here's just 10 or 12 of my cities. So you can see these are all relative to Chicago. Chicago is kind of the middle city in our sample, so everything's relative to Chicago. Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, these are creating sort of on a market to book ratio more value. You've got Miami and Houston creating apparently less value. You've got some companies in between. This is in the first 20 years of my sample. Before I show you the rest of the results, if you think about the world sort of flattening, so there's a lot of variation across cities here, but if you think about the world flattening and location becoming sort of more or less irrelevant, then what you might expect is you might expect to see that variation across cities sort of compressing over time. Okay? That's kind of the world is flat idea that Friedman might have. Well, that's what actually happens in the second half of the sample. And so what you can see here is the variation has more than doubled. And it hasn't doubled in kind of a random way. The good cities get better, the bad cities get worse. That's sort of what you're seeing. So the punchline here that I would say if I were presenting this to an academic audience is the cross-city or cross-sectional heterogeneity is expanding over time, and it's expanding in a non-random way. It's not just scrambling where Houston went way up and Seattle went way down and just sort of, gnarled all together. It's in a very organized fashion. This is not just a tech thing, by the way. Notice that I've split the sample pre and post 1995. What if you look at the sample just prior to 95? So up to here, and then forget about whatever is on the rest of the page. Here I've used Tableau to sort of show this. Here's my city fixed effects in the first 5 years. There's the next 5 years. There's the next 5 years. There's the next 5 years. You can just see the steady march where cities seem to become more important for determining value. So cities are becoming more important. Your environment, after controlling for industry and year effects, seems like it's becoming more important, at least from these univariate statistics. What have we done here? Absolutely nothing that's not descriptive. But these patterns aren't in the literature. There's nothing like this in the literature, so we're going to try to push on the descriptive value for this and think a little bit about what could potentially be driving these differences in city fixed effects. This is a fantastic book. So getting back to the idea of just where to get ideas from, this is an urban economist at UC Berkeley. He's going to inherit, I think, sort of the urban economics crown from Ed Glazer. He's going to sort of take it into the next generation. This is a fantastic book that I can't recommend highly enough, just for some ideas. And he's sort of recasting some older ideas from the urban literature, this idea that there's a creative class of workers, this idea of agglomeration. What's agglomeration? Agglomeration is, I'm a bright guy, John's a bright guy, but if we put our offices together, we're both like, genius guys. We're both Philip Bond guys together if we can put our offices next to one another. So it's this idea of a synergy. So agglomeration effects are 1 + 1 = 5 or something. And that's the idea that Moretti's getting at with this book that he wrote. We are applying, or we're trying to test this idea, and I use the word test because we're not exactly testing a theory, we're just sort of describing some empirical facts in the data, that certain cities are better incubators for this agglomeration than others. And so that's going to ultimately, we predict, work its way into value creation. I want to sort of soft pedal that last link. There's a lot more to this last link that I want to get into here. It's not obvious that if some cities are productive, that leads to higher stock price. It's more than that. Let me just stop with that for now. I do want to show you a few graphs that I think are interesting. This is where Twitter employees went to school. So you see two things here. Number one, there's a lot of good schools. There's also a lot of just California schools. So the schools that are around Twitter end up having their employees work for Twitter. Same for Google. There's a lot of really good schools. You got Cornell, you got Michigan, but there's a lot of California. Who would have guessed San Jose State has the 10th or whatever that is, 8th or 9th highest percentage of Google's workforce from San Jose State? That's not a school that I would have expected. Again, location, proximity seems to be really important. So what we've sort of got in mind is that maybe there's something to this idea of education and firm values. Again, the idea might be something like the following. Go back 40 or 50 years. Cities differ in how educated their people are. College education rates, you can also use high school education rates, although there's not as much variation in high school rates. The idea is when the internet sort of took hold, does that have the same effect on smart cities as it does for maybe non-smart cities or cities that don't have as high college education rates? Turns out that that's exactly what we see in the data. So if you look at where the tokens Q ratios, you can also think about this as just stock returns. It looks more or less the same with stock returns. This is the difference in the city fixed effects for Qs. You can just think about it as these are the cities where stock prices have gone up a lot. These are cities where stock prices have not gone up a lot or have actually gone down. This is college education rates. You see a very strong pattern here. So it seems like stock prices have steadily gone up over a 40-year period in the cities with the highest education rates. Again, there's more to the theory than it just sounds like from talking, but I'm not going to get into. That's just a descriptive pattern. What you also see is you see weather predicts stock returns, and weather has been used in the urban economics literature as a proxy for human capital. Again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, but the idea is that as people's incomes have gone up, weather is a normal good, and so people have gotten pickier about where they live. And so if you think about using weather as an instrument for human capital, that could be another way to identify this effect of human capital, agglomeration, firm values, and that seems to be what's going on in the data. Last thing, and this really surprised us. Adding value, adding firm value, isn't about adding people. So the first thing we thought we were going to find is, this is just kind of like recasting high population growth. Seattle's growing a lot, San Francisco's growing a lot, Boston's growing a lot. Aren't you just kind of saying people are attracted to areas where stock prices have gone up, or maybe it's that stock prices have gone up when they add lots of workers? That's not it. These are the top 10 fastest growing cities in the sample. Where have people moved? Atlanta, Charlotte, Vegas, Dallas, Houston, Tampa. It's places where real estate's cheap. That's not where stock prices have gone up. So people are attracted to cheap housing when you look at the global migration patterns. It's not those people that matter for stock prices. It's a different kind of person. That's maybe 250,000 of people that are working in specific industries. Their values locked up in their heads. They're moving to Seattle. They're moving to Boston. They're moving to DC. They're moving to Minneapolis. That's where the firm value. So it's not following the people. It's following the smart people. Kind of a different perspective on thinking about this. Just have about a couple minutes, John?
Yes.
Okay. So the last thing, this is just the same patterns in stock returns. So I'm not going to spend any more time on this. Talk about one or two other quick things. This is a paper with Sheridan and Johan where we looked at regional differences, not in firm value creation, but in another way that you could rank cities, which is how much do they cook in the books. So look at firms that are headquartered in Seattle or San Diego or Boston or Tampa. How much are they engaging in white-collar crime or financial misconduct? And you can see I've given you the top 5 cities here, the top 4 cities. These are the cleanest 4 cities, and these are the dirtiest 4 cities. I'm actually from Texas. I'm not proud of the fact that Houston and Dallas are 2 of the dirtiest in the sample. These are just averages. Here's an example. I'm learning a program called Tableau. If none of you know it, you should learn it. It's kind of neat to think about how you can visualize these things. This is the financial misconduct rate of the top 20 biggest cities in the United States, and then over time. And what you can see is when you say Seattle is a clean city or Minneapolis is a clean city, what that means. It's not that they never have any fraud. It's just that their fraud waves, you can see a little fraud wave there, you can see a little fraud wave there, are not as frequent as the dirtier cities where Miami, where you have a fraud wave here and a longer lasting fraud wave here, or two big fraud waves for St. Louis. So it paints a different perspective of the cross-sectional variation. I'm going to skip some of this stuff because my slides got a little bit long. I did want to say a couple of things, just as parting shots along the lines of what John and Joey and Warren and others have talked about. In general, there are advantages to working in an emerging, growing area. It's sort of obvious that when if you're working in empirical capital structure right now, good luck. You're going to step on a million people's toes. It's a very thorny area. If you're working on something that's a little more open, it's probably easier to make a contribution. If you're computing papers and there's significant value just doing purely descriptive work, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of your research agenda, but it does mean that you can do descriptive work and still make some progress. In fact, the earliest work on any area probably should be descriptive work, which will give the fodder for the theorists to start helping us understand the empirical predictions and guide further empirical work. As a job market candidate, there's a lot of extrapolation that occurs with respect to your job market paper. Joey mentioned this. Rigorous work that showcases skills is far better than a cute one-off paper. I've seen this happen a lot where people would say, that's a really cool paper. What's the second paper in this person's pipeline? If it looks like a lucky break that you caught, that's not going to be a good market paper. You need to give schools that are hiring you a reason to take a bet on you over the long term. Skills are a better way to do that than a cute one-off paper. As written from the perspective of someone who's written kind of cute one-off papers, those are not good market papers. Those are good papers to publish later on, but not as a market paper. John mentioned this a second ago, and I'll just reiterate it and then sit down. This profession can be really tough on your ego. It's, Philip, what's the rejection rate at JF?
Above 90.
Yeah, it's a lot above 90, isn't it? 94 or something?
No, not much.
Okay. So there aren't that many things in life where you're smacked down, 9.5 times out of 10. This is one of those jobs where it's going to happen. So it's not just developing a thick skin. A thick skin is important. What I would say is the following. Find something that you are intrinsically, inherently interested in, and it will get you through the rejection that's coming. The process of creating knowledge is difficult, and it's good that the profession is so picky about what it puts in journals, because it's important that we put into journals what's interesting and right, ideally, and so the process is supposed to be that way. This is a big and ever-expanding field. You can find something that inherently interests you. It's worth spending some time to figure out what that is, because that's gonna ultimately pay dividends later on. It's certainly helpful. Okay, that's all I have to say.